Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum: buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you get exclusive discounts or your very own events programme. Today I am delighted to welcome Tony Insall. Tony has over 30 years of experience with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, with service in Nigeria, Hong Kong, China and Malaysia. He is a senior visiting professor in the Department of War Studies at King's College London and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Today, Tony will share the gripping story of his great uncle, one of the first pilots to be awarded the Victoria Cross. There will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audiences. For our online audience, post the questions in the Q&A chat bar and we will put them to the speaker at the end. Moving on to some technical points. If we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us whilst we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest you click the refresh button. That solves most issues. A member of the team will always be active in the chat. With all that said, I'll now pass over to Tony. I hope you'll enjoy the talk. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Tony.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I'm going to talk today about my great-uncle, Gilbert Insall, a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps who holds the unique record of being the only person to have both won the Victoria Cross and to have successfully escaped from a German prison camp during the First World War. But I'm also going to delve into some related subjects which have never really been explored before. What support was officially provided to help Allied prisoners escape during the war? The answer is, before the beginning of 1917, nothing. And what prompted that to change? My family's experiences, which they gained from their work in supporting Gilbert, provide some fascinating insights into why it happened, for they were in touch with both of the two British organisations which began to get involved, and the French intelligence organisation as well, who were generally better organised and more efficient. They gave my grandfather, as you'll hear, some very generous and valuable assistance. But what was it like trying to escape from a prison camp all those years ago? What was involved? Well, imagine yourself, for a moment, about 12 feet underground, in a confined space measuring 18 inches by 12 inches, a little larger than a chimney flue, with a guttering candle uncomfortably close to your head, guttering because the fetid, foul air prevents it from burning properly. But you need it so close in order to enable you to see the sandstone in front of you as you try to gouge it out with a screwdriver and remove the spoil. Then you try, awkwardly, to push the earth back under your body to your partner, who is lying behind you. He carefully gathers it into a basket, then crawls slowly backwards in the dark, gaining purchase with his toes and elbows. After a few yards, he reaches the bottom of the shaft of the tunnel, which you're digging, where he stores it in bags for subsequent disposal in the eaves, yes, the eaves of the building. And think what it would be like to do that almost every night for 5 months. That's what my great-uncle Gilbert endured while digging the tunnel which eventually enabled him, on a freezing cold night in March 1917, to escape with 4 others, including Henry McWilliam, who drew this sketch, from Heidelberg prison camp. The winters in Heidelberg were, and sometimes still are, unpleasantly cold. When the tunnel was completed, they intended to wait until it grew warmer. But a tip-off from a Tame guard revealed that all British prisoners were about to be moved to another camp. So they decided to leave straight away and walk to Switzerland. In appalling weather and heavy snow, they got a third of the way, surviving for 5 days before being recaptured, quite exhausted. Gilbert would have to wait another 6 months before he succeeded in reaching safety. I well remember the first time I met him. It was in the mid-1950s, when our lives were more formal and small children were not much included in family gatherings. So I was excited for the first time to be allowed to join the adults when he and my great-aunt Olwyn came for lunch. My mother asked how their journey had been from Yorkshire, and Olwyn, a rather precise and correct woman, stiffened, looked at Gilbert and said crisply and emphatically, "Ah, he's a mad old bugger." She explained that Gilbert preferred to drive in the middle of the road. There were, of course, fewer cars then, liked overtaking, and hated being overtaken himself. Gilbert ignored this exchange and just stoically got on with his lunch. That memory has stayed with me, particularly since I started thinking and researching and writing a book about him. For Olwyn's description of Gilbert as a competitive, determined and stubborn driver picks out some of the characteristics necessary for someone to achieve what Gilbert did. Two things which require rather different types of courage. It's a theme worth exploring further. When Lieutenant Peter Anderson got back to London after successfully escaping from Germany in October 1915, he was given an audience with King George V, who often met such returnees. The king told him that, "I consider the bravery involved in escaping is, if anything, greater than that required on the battlefield, which was usually the product of the heat of the moment." So, to leave the comparative safety of a prison camp and travel through an unknown country where everyone was an enemy, suffering hunger, privation, and often extreme physical conditions, demanded not just courage, but determination, ingenuity, imagination, guile, good planning, and a very large dose of luck. Talking of hunger, when Johnny Evans and Sidney Buckley, who were both RFC officers, arrived in Switzerland after jumping off a train in June 1917, they had lost 3 stone during their escape and weighed just 7 stone. Or of privation, Jeff Green, a Canadian who spent time in solitary confinement next to Gilbert, wrote of captured prisoners whose return he witnessed. It was sad to see the continuous stream being brought back, practically everyone in the last stage of exhaustion from lack of nourishment, cold, and lying out night after night in the rain. And as for luck, Lawrence Wingfield had reached the River Ems, the final major barrier to crossing from Germany into Holland, when he was discovered by a sentry. The man was an Alsatian who hated Germans, and so instead of arresting him, he took him to a point further down the river, showed him the best crossing site, and also gave him advice on the location of patrols. Wingfield reached Holland safely. Gilbert and his younger brother Jack, my grandfather, were born in France in the 1890s. That's Gilbert on the right and Jack in the middle. There they are dressed up as sailors in the curious fashion of that time. The little chap on the left is Cecil, the third brother, who, like the other two, also joined the Royal Flying Corps. Gilbert and Jack studied dentistry at the University of Paris. My great-grandfather, another Gilbert, was a dentist himself, and they had aspirations to take over his practice and live a comfortable life. But the war was to change all that. They also played hockey for the university against other teams in Northern Europe. And they befriended early French aviators such as Louis Blériot, the first to cross the English Channel, and the Farman brothers, who sometimes gave them flights in the fragile aircraft they were developing. That's Gilbert's first aerial photograph, taken when he went up with Charles Farman. Through the mass of wiring and supporting struts, you can make out the shadow of the aircraft and a couple of horses in the foreground. When war broke out, the family left Paris for England, and Gilbert and Jack enlisted. You had to be 19 to go on active service overseas, so Jack lied about his age. I'd sometimes wondered whether that piece of family law was true, but an unearthed confirmation of the story in the National Archives. You can see up at the top that Gilbert was claiming in his certificate of attestation that he was 20 years and 3 months old, and there's Jack claiming to be 19 years and 6 months. Well, you can do the maths for yourself. He'd been advised by the recruiting sergeant about the need to do that. After a boring few months spent drilling and doing what seemed to them to be tedious exercises, they heard that the Royal Flying Corps was looking for recruits and signed up in March 1915. Training was rudimentary and often dangerous. Of the 7,000 airmen who were killed while flying during the First World War, more than 2,000, nearly a third, died in training accidents. They achieved the first stage of their qualification for the Royal Aero Club certificate after just a week, and Jack did so on his first solo flight, which must have displeased his elder brother somewhat, though he followed soon after. Here's a group of them at Brooklands, with the genial Canadian Stanley Cors with a stick in the middle, and Gilbert on his right. Cors and several others shown here were killed on the Western Front within the next year. By the time they'd finished their training, RFC reconnaissance flights had already been able to make a crucial difference to operations on the Western Front. First, when the French army began its retreat from Mons in August 1914, RFC reconnaissance showed that the BEF was in danger of being outflanked to the west, while the French retreat to the east was exposing their right flank. This enabled protective measures to be taken. Historians have commented that the air reconnaissance that came back with this information was perhaps the most fruitful of the whole war, though I think that perhaps the RFC performed another equally valuable service shortly afterwards. Following the subsequent British retreat from Mons towards the Marne, contact was lost with the German First Army, commanded by General Alexander von Kluck, against which the BEF had been deployed. This caused considerable concern. RFC reconnaissance helped to establish that the First Army was moving across their front to link up with other German armies, which would enable them to attack the French in strength. This maneuver left von Kluck's own right flank exposed, and French forces, commanded by General Joffre, attacked along a 100-mile front during the Battle of the Marne, which forced the Germans to retreat. This great strategic victory marked the end of the German sweep into France, as their fast-moving offensive was curtailed and removed the threat to Paris. Increasing German attacks on RFC reconnaissance aircraft led to measures to protect them. Both Gilbert and Jack joined 11 Squadron, which was the first dedicated fighter squadron formed for this purpose, and after further training at Netheravon, was sent to France in July 1915. The squadron was equipped with Vickers FB5s, and you can see all 12 of their aircraft lined up at Folkestone and ready to cross the Channel. They were told to climb to 3,000 feet before making the crossing, so that if they had an engine failure, they would probably be able to glide the rest of the way across. Though, as an extra precaution, they were issued with an inner tube to be worn around the neck, which they would have had to inflate for themselves if they actually came down in the water, and you might wonder how much or how little confidence that would have inspired. The Vickers was a two-seater with both a pilot and an observer who sat in front, and was known as a pusher because it had its engine at the back. It weighed a ton, had a top speed of 70 miles an hour, and took half an hour to climb to its operating height of 9,000 feet. Now, by way of comparison, you might be interested to know that in the course of my research, I went up to RAF Coningsby, which is where 11th Squadron is located, and was shown over a Typhoon, which they have been using for the last few years. A Typhoon weighs about 20 tons with a when its ordnance is attached, is about 22 tons. It's got a top speed of around 1,500 or so knots. And when I asked the pilot who was showing me how long it took to climb to 9,000 feet, he looked at me as though I was mad and said, "What on earth do you want to know that for?" So I told him, and he said, "Oh, just a few seconds," and showed me later, more recently actually, a video of the Typhoon taking off and just disappearing at high speed. Now, that's clearly what we're used to today, but it's worth bearing in mind that that aircraft represented the cutting edge of technology in 1915, just as the Typhoon does now. The cockpit was open, lacking any protection from the elements, and the crews froze, often literally. You can see how exposed they were, and the clothing which they wore was woefully inadequate. And there's Gilbert trying to look enthusiastic. Aircraft engines at this time, on German aircraft as much as on British, were often unreliable, and their failure left crews vulnerable to attack and liable to be shot down or to crash behind enemy lines. Weapons, usually Lewis guns, were prone to jam because cartridges were faulty. That could also be fatal, so their lives were full of uncertainty. That's Jack test firing his Lewis gun into the ground just in front of his mechanic's toes. He was to lose an eye in an accident a year later when examining just such a piece of defective ammunition, which exploded. That curtailed his flying career, though he continued in the RFC, serving in Paris, and was well placed to provide advice and assistance to Gilbert in his preparations for escape. Those early aircraft were slow and difficult to maneuver. It took skill and subterfuge to catch an enemy aircraft unawares or to lure the pilot into combat. Engagements, they couldn't really be called dogfights in those days, were rare and usually only effective when at very close range, by which I mean about 50 yards. That's a Vickers from 11th Squadron flying over the lines near Bapaume at 9,000 feet. And that photograph was taken by Jack. Those dark smudges you can see are German anti-aircraft fire. On the 7th of November 1915, Gilbert succeeded in luring a German aviatic into combat, and after outmaneuvering him, opened fire and brought the aircraft down. It made a forced landing. However, it wasn't destroyed, so he descended to 500 feet, and dropped an incendiary bomb on it, setting it on fire as the crew escaped. That's an artist's impression of what happened, which was published in the Illustrated London News a few weeks later. He decided that in such hostile territory it would have been too dangerous to climb to a safe height before flying back over the lines. So he actually chose to cross at low altitude himself and came under heavy fire. His petrol tank was holed and the engine stopped, but he was able to glide sufficiently to be able to make a landing some 500 yards behind the French front line, sheltering behind some trees out of sight. But some French troops escorted him and his observer into a dugout and opened a bottle of red wine, which they must have seriously appreciated. German artillery, aided by a spotter aircraft, fired over 150 shells to try to destroy the aircraft. Nonetheless, Gilbert went out to inspect it, decided that the damage was reparable, and arranged for spares and mechanics to be sent up from the squadron. He erected screens to conceal all this activity, which would otherwise have drawn heavier fire, and supervised the repairs overnight. Then he asked the French to repair the shell holes so he could take off. At dawn, with a sandbag in the front seat, as he didn't want to expose his observer, Thomas Donald, to unnecessary risk, he flew off through another hail of German fire and returned to base for breakfast. That's part of his combat report, which, perhaps not surprisingly, doesn't make any mention of French refreshments. For this, he would be awarded a VC. But before he received the news, he was shot down and captured the following month. In an exchange with another aviatic, his Vickers was again disabled by a bullet through the petrol tank. This time, he was too far behind the German lines for him to glide back to safety, though he started to try. But then a German anti-aircraft shell exploded just beneath his aircraft, and he was hit in the buttock and badly injured by a piece of shrapnel which weighed about 450 grams. Though he temporarily lost consciousness, he recovered sufficiently to be able to land the Vickers, though was unsuccessful in his attempts to destroy it. That's a German photograph. As he lay on a stretcher being examined, he recognized the medical orderly, whom you can see there, who was tending him, the one at his feet. While university students, they had played against each other in Hanover just 18 months before. And for my money, that must surely be one of the most remarkable images taken during the First World War. And it was certainly a highlight of my research because of its personal nature. The orderly accompanied him to a field hospital, remaining with him overnight. Sadly, we don't know what happened to him afterwards. And here's a photograph of the aircraft being examined by German officers just behind the right wing there. It wasn't badly damaged and was disassembled and taken away for a closer examination. And here's another highlight. This is a document from the German military archive in Karlsruhe, which is part of their detailed report on Gilbert's interrogation. Some of you may know that the RAF flattened the main German military archive when they bombed Potsdam in April 1945. But I'm delighted to say that they missed this provincial one. The documents we found there are comprehensive, and they also included their reports on the interrogation of Donald, Gilbert's observer, as well as a number of other captured RFC officers. Some, Gilbert was one of them, didn't give much away, but others carried papers and other materials which they should really have left at home, and also talked a lot. Far too much, you might think. For example, about the effectiveness of German anti-aircraft fire and weather reporting systems, which not surprisingly were subjects of great interest. Two things about this are noteworthy. First, for much of the war, members of the fighting services weren't warned about the dangers of interrogation because the War Office didn't want to raise the possibility of their surrendering. So they weren't prepared for what might be in store for them. Secondly, during British debriefs of those who successfully escaped or were repatriated, the subject of interrogation was not raised once in all of the reports I read, even in those written by MI1A, which was responsible from early 1917 for studying conditions in prison camps and treatment of prisoners. However, things did begin to change towards the end of 1916, when British interrogation of German prisoners provided information about German interrogation techniques. Hans Baldemus, that guy there, made the following statement. When a British officer, a flying officer, is captured, he is taken at once to the nearest flight mess. He lunches and dines, perhaps for several days, with the mess. No actual interrogation takes place, but the Flying Corps intelligence officer from Corps headquarters temporarily attaches himself to the mess in question. No captured flying officer is ever put through a formal examination or asked a direct question during this process. Because he was in hospital, Gilbert, who's seated third from the right, didn't get this deluxe treatment, but he was nonetheless questioned quite intensively. Baldemus was quite an arrogant chap. He must have been an interrogator's ideal subject because he boasted about the extent of his knowledge on all sorts of sensitive topics, including the extent to which German signals intelligence intercepted radio transmissions from British reconnaissance aircraft. This alerted them to areas which were about to become British artillery targets, enabled them to take precautions, and, he estimated, saved a considerable number of German lives. I didn't find these reports in the National Archives, incidentally. They were found in the French military archives in Vincennes because we passed them to the French at the time. Reports like this helped to bring about a change in attitudes, as they showed the extent to which German techniques were obtaining valuable information on a range of subjects, and so encouraged the War Office not just to prevent such leaks, but also to start thinking about helping valuable Allied prisoners of war who were aircrew or sometimes tank commanders to escape and get back home. And thus we can see the beginnings of the work of two different organizations, GHQ-1B, the military one, and MI-1C, later better known as MI6 or the Secret Intelligence Service. More of that in a moment. At this point, it's worth providing an overview of the camps where Gilbert was confined and highlighting those from which he made his escapes. The red diamonds that you can see are places where he was held. I haven't included Cologne, but that's where he was in the prison hospital. And you might wonder about the red diamond in the Netherlands. I'll come to that later on. After 3 months in hospital in Cologne, he was sent in late February to Mainz, and then on to a pretty unpleasant Fort Prince Karl at Ingolstadt, near Munich, where he spent a further 6 months. Then on to Heidelberg, Crefeld, and finally Stroen. It took Gilbert 9 long months to recover from his injury. It was serious enough that he was examined several times for possible medical repatriation, but he failed the final board. He was then sent to Heidelberg, where he found a couple of other like-minded British prisoners and started planning an escape in earnest. But this was soon interrupted by another medical issue. He came down with appendicitis, which his German captors ignored for far too long. Sorry, that shouldn't have happened. He was eventually, when his condition worsened considerably, he was taken to hospital, where the doctor who operated on him admitted that if he'd arrived about half an hour later, he would probably have died. His operation was performed without anaesthetic or drugs. These were in short supply, and prisoners often didn't receive them. A surgeon friend of mine gave me a detailed explanation about what would have been involved, how painful it would have been, and how the lack of drugs may have compromised his recovery. It's not surprising that he took about a month in hospital beginning his convalescence, and he was still frail when he got back to the camp. When he got to Heidelberg, he was already pretty well equipped with escape material. He'd been working imaginatively to establish safe means of communicating with both Brother Jack and his father Gilbert Sr. He wrote secret messages in milk on the inside of envelopes because he knew that the Germans only actually tested the writing paper with the text on for those sorts of messages. But my family didn't know that, so he asked a French officer who was using a prearranged code to write to his mother, who just happened, fortuitously, to be one of Gilbert Sr.'s patients, and to tell him to iron the inside of the envelopes. When they did that, most produced long messages, and thereafter they worked out a viable system of communication, enabling them to warn him whenever they were sending him contraband. These coded messages and their smuggled equipment, mainly maps, files, and compasses needed for escaping, were never discovered. Gilbert did better, even better, with this device. That's not great art. It was painted by a French prisoner when he was in Ingolstadt. But when the commandant at Heidelberg, perhaps conscious of the PR advantages, agreed that he could send it home, he was allowed to put it in a wooden box to protect it. He drove out a couple of knots in the wood, filed them down in the middle, and wrote long messages on thin paper which he wrapped around them and reinserted into the knots. And you can see that up at the top. You can see lying, I'm sorry, it's not a brilliant photograph. There's the message, and it's attached on the right-hand end to one of the knots. And here are the knots and the wood from which they were taken. And this container held a map which Jack prepared for dispatch to Gilbert, though it was never actually sent. You can see the flanges which would have been used to solder it to the underside of a tin, which would then have been given a false bottom to conceal the contents. Gilbert stored the most important items needed for escape equipment in his burglar's bag, which was a key part of his escape equipment. German searches, after he was recaptured, never discovered it, even when he was thoroughly searched. Back to the Heidelberg tunnel, and a chance to exercise your imagination a little more. They tunneled at night because it was safer to get access to the cellar. Imagine the difficulties of keeping secret what they were doing, not just from the guards, but also from other prisoners outside the room they all occupied, and the risks that they would have been running. Here's one. The German sentries patrolled past the windows of the cellar in which they were digging. The tunnel entrance is in the bottom right-hand corner there. If more than one window had been left open, even though it was dark inside, they decided that it would be too dangerous to move around in the room, and so they couldn't dig that night. And here's another sketch of where they stored the earth, up in the eaves of what was a very solid brick-built construction. And overall, they excavated, though didn't store all of it up here, some 5 tons of earth. Germans very rarely came up there, but one did once, and 3 of them had to leave in a hurry. Gilbert locked a door behind him with a skeleton key which had been forged from a melted down aluminium spoon, and they all legged it. Some of the prisoners by then were past masters at picking German pockets and making wax impressions of keys and then replacing the keys without being noticed. Remarkably, the incident didn't spark any further investigation, though to be on the safe side, they left the cellar alone for a few days afterwards. But back to the cellar again. On the night when they were planning to leave, Gilbert was standing there with the trapdoor open and various equipment lying around, preparing to go down and make the final preparations. The prisoner's alarm sentry system failed, and he had about 10 seconds' notice of a German chef approaching the cellar accompanied by several French orderlies to collect some bread. Gilbert kicked the equipment into the tunnel shaft, leapt in and covered himself with a dark coat. He surreptitiously signalled to one of the orderlies while the chef was picking up the bread, who moved over in front of him to try and block the view. That's just about the closest hair's breadth escape that they had. You really couldn't make it up, could you? After their recapture, they were moved up to Crefeld, just opposite Venlo there, which was conveniently close from the prisoner's point of view to the Dutch border. There, Gilbert served a sentence in solitary confinement for escaping in a cell which measured some 6 foot by 9 foot and was much darker inside than the gloomy exterior you can see here. That's a photograph which Gilbert himself took after the war. It was during this period that my family started to develop links with 3 different intelligence organizations to explore how to help Gilbert further. Jack did best with the French, who, as I mentioned, were better organized and showed extraordinary generosity in giving him information, as well as maps and other equipment which he needed. Remarkably, on their first meeting, his French contact told Jack about Gilbert's escape from Heidelberg, that he had been moved to Crefeld, which Jack hadn't known, and that the French prisoners at that camp had been moved elsewhere. They had almost finished a tunnel, but had had no time to take advantage of it. So he gave Jack the details, as well as drawings, for him to send to Gilbert. Unfortunately, they didn't reach Gilbert in time to be of use. Jack later put Sidney Buckley, the RFC officer who I mentioned earlier, who was by then working for GHQ 1B, in touch with the French because they hadn't by then worked out a means of doing that for themselves. Buckley started briefing RFC officers on how to behave after capture and how to communicate safely with them through their families. Actually, it was MI1C who was the authorized contact point, probably because of their greater familiarity with codes and ciphers. And here is evidence of the family's early contact with MI1C. That's a letter signed by John Snepp, who ran the small section that was set up late in 1916. And a few months later, Jack and Gilbert Sr. made it clear to John Snepp that they didn't need any assistance at that stage to help Gilbert, as he had by then already got all the equipment which he needed. These themes are developed at rather more length in my book, and they provide background to the process which eventually led to the establishment of MI9 at the beginning of the Second World War. Incidentally, neither Jack nor Gilbert breathed a word to anyone else in the family about their contacts with MI1C, or much detail about GHQ-1B either. I came across these details and others in the course of my research. And again, personally, as you can imagine, that was another enormous highlight. Gilbert's other two escape attempts, like at Heidelberg, involved at least temporary confinement in extraordinarily cramped spaces. At Crefeld, though, instead of 5 months of preparation, it took him about half an hour to get ready. Not long after he'd completed his sentence in solitary confinement, the prisoners woke up one morning in early May to find the barbed wire fence ringed by an extra battalion of troops from the Russian front with fixed machine guns pointing into the camp. It appears that the Germans had picked up a rumour of a mutiny and a mass breakout attempt. Given the proximity of the Dutch frontier, that seems quite a reasonable concern. The prisoners were told that they'd be leaving the camp for another camp the next day, and they should pack their luggage, which would be sent on to them separately. Gilbert noticed that the carts transporting the luggage, once loaded, were not constantly supervised. He asked the orderlies responsible for doing it, for stacking up their possessions on these carts, to leave a gap in the middle of one of them. Then he gathered his burglar's bag and maps, and together with William Morritt, took advantage of German inattention and hid in the small gap which had been prepared. They got out of the camp without incident, but throughout this process, because the gap was so small, Morritt was actually kneeling on Gilbert's head, which can't have been much fun. But after getting out of off the cart without being noticed by the driver and walking through the local town, they couldn't find adequate cover on the other side and were recaptured some 5 miles away. The two were subsequently sent to different camps. Morritt ended up in Schwarmstedt and promptly dug a tunnel, though through peaty undersoil, much easier to work with. As he was emerging, he was shot dead at point-blank range by a sentry who was waiting for him. He had no chance. The escaper behind him was also badly wounded. That wasn't an isolated incident. Some other prisoners met a similar fate. Harold Medlicott, who escaped a record 14 times during 2.5 years in captivity, was shot dead with his escaping partner, Joseph Walter, when they were being returned to Bad Kolberg after his latest attempt. That was also clearly premeditated. Later in May, Gilbert was moved to Stroen, a little bit further north, which was designated as a punishment camp. The physical conditions there were unpleasant enough, with bad sanitation, bad food, leaking huts and flea-ridden beds and extremes of weather, but there was also maltreatment. Not just arbitrary sentences of solitary confinement or the confiscation of small comforts, but physical maltreatment as well. Prisoners were sometimes bayoneted for what were at worst very minor infractions, and sometimes for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. One was bayoneted in the lung and nearly lost his life. Another, Gerald Featherstone Knight, who was bayoneted in the thigh, got his own back once he'd recovered from the operation, by making a very imaginative escape from the bathhouse, which was outside the Bois, just over here. He noticed that one of the rooms there contained a tiny alcove about 11 inches deep and a foot wide, just behind a stove. He painstakingly constructed a screen from cardboard, decorated with a finish which matched the dirty whitewash of the bathroom, and with help from fellow prisoners, who also concealed his activities from the watching German guard, hid himself behind it at the end of a morning bathing session. The disguise was so good that it wasn't noticed while the room was subsequently searched. When night left, he concealed the screen which he'd used, and the searching Germans never knew how he'd got away. Knight's escape came as a welcome surprise to Gilbert, for he wasn't aware of his plan and was in the middle of planning an escape himself from precisely the same site. He would have had good reason to be concerned that if they'd discovered how Knight had made his escape, the Germans would have taken additional security measures. After making a careful and surreptitious survey of the internal dimensions and those outside, Gilbert, Michael Harrison and Claude Templar, an old friend with whom Gilbert had studied at the Anglo-Saxon school in Paris a few years earlier, had discovered that the bathroom floor was raised some 8 or 9 inches above the ground. Although their ablutions were watched by a German sentry from the door, the milling prisoners were able to conceal from him how Gilbert and the others carefully cut a hole in the floor and scooped out and shifted sufficient earth to be able to make space for them to hide in. This took less than 10 days. Each day, when they were finished, they needed to replace the floorboards and carefully disguise the cuts which they'd made in the wood, for they knew that the Germans searched the bathhouse every day after the prisoners were freed. But during this period, to their further consternation, they discovered that 2 other prisoners had cut through the floor on the opposite side of the washroom and started an excavation with a view to exactly the same sort of escape which they were planning. Such was the density of the throng of prisoners there that neither had noticed or become aware of what the other was doing. The 2 parties conferred and agreed to join forces and make their exit together. Since Gilbert's project was further advanced, it was decided to expand the space already dug underneath the floor. So on a hot August morning, the 5 prisoners crawled into the cramped space which they'd prepared and hid there for 17 hours. There was only one small air hole on one side which provided minimal ventilation, and the atmosphere would have been stifling. They were missed at a roll call in the early evening, and the area was thoroughly searched. They could hear angry shouts across the camp and stomping boots above them. As had been prearranged, someone by then had cut the wire on the far side of the camp, which laid a persuasive false trail. There was a volley of shots at one stage, suggesting that 2 search parties had run into each other. But when it quietened down and they attempted to leave, they found that they couldn't get out of their stuffy, foul, sweaty hole. The searching Germans had left the door open, and its position prevented them from opening their trapdoor. Fortunately, from his burglar's bag, Gilbert extracted a penknife, poked it up between 2 planks, and slowly moved the door away, and they crept out undetected and split into 2 groups. They carried maps like these, remarkably detailed and very useful. These were actually used by Lawrence Wingfield, who escaped shortly after Gilbert and travelled an almost identical route. I mentioned his encounter earlier with the Alsatian Guard. In view of comments Lawrence wrote in his memoirs, I think it's very likely that these are copies he made of Gilbert's maps. Gilbert and his companions had decided to travel light, carrying just chocolate, biltong, bacon, porridge, and a few biscuits, as well as solid fuel and a Tommy cooker. Since it was summer, they thought they could live off the land, foraging for fruit and vegetables. This worked pretty well, and they even found a churn of milk, the first they'd tasted for nearly 2 years. Inspired by that, they decided to milk a cow the next night. Their target turned out to be an ill-tempered bull, and they only just won the race to the next fence. There's Gilbert in his escape clothes. You can see the flying wings on his jacket, which has been turned inside out. Travelling only at night, they reached the Dutch border after 9 days. The area was intensively guarded. They knew from bitter experience, this was Claude Templar's 13th attempt, that many prisoners were caught at this final hurdle. They were usually exhausted from lack of sleep and lack of food and the exertions of their long journey, and the cumulative effects of these could cloud their judgment and lead to poor decisions and recapture. But Gilbert and co. had husbanded their resources carefully and were in good condition, so they did nothing hasty. They took their time, reconnoitred the area carefully, swam the River Ems, and spent more than 7 hours crawling painstakingly slowly and cautiously past a line of German sentries, before they reached safety in Holland on the 4th of September 1917. To their surprise and disappointment, the Dutch parked them in a quarantine camp for several days, where they were quartered alongside some German deserters. But they, there we are again, but they also met Gerald Featherstone Knight, so they had a friendly face and many stories to exchange. And that's a group photograph with Knight, who's sitting below them, and Gilbert in the middle. Eventually, they were bailed out by a diplomat from the Consulate General in Rotterdam and sailed home a few days afterwards. Just over 3 weeks later, and a bare month after he'd crept out of Struan, Gilbert was presented with his VC by King George V outside Buckingham Palace. What a contrast that must have been for him. And he was later, in 1919, awarded an MC in recognition of his gallantry in escaping from captivity while a prisoner of war. After the war, my grandfather Jack got a job at the Imperial War Museum, where he was responsible for setting up the RAF section. In the course of that, he was asked to commission a few portraits of pilots who'd won the VC. Some, like Albert Ball and James McCudden, were posthumous, but they also included Edward Newling's portrait of Gilbert, so I've got an even more personal interest in this very fine portrait, which, as you may have noticed, features on the cover of my book. And a brief word about their third brother, Cecil, who joined the RFC in 1918. After the war, he had a number of different jobs, including, as Gilbert did, a stint with the Military Inter-Allied Commission of Control in Germany. He was then recruited in 1933 by the Passport Control Department, otherwise known as the Secret Intelligence Service, and posted to Berlin, where he worked as the deputy to Frank Foley until the outbreak of war in 1939. He also issued visas to German Jews who were wanting to get away. This is one which he issued to Lothar Auerbach in February 1939. His family later contacted me about it, wanting to get in touch with Cecil's family to thank them for what he had done. And as you might imagine, I felt good about that for weeks afterwards. Gilbert remained actively involved in the RAF, serving overseas in Egypt and Iraq, where he won a mention in dispatches in 1928. Reaching the rank of group captain, he retired in 1945. Thereafter, he continued his interest in aerial photography for archaeological purposes. He discovered the Bronze Age site at Woodhenge, which is shown there, very close to Stonehenge, just a few years earlier. And here he is at a reception in 1968 to mark the 50th anniversary of the founding of the RAF in April 1918. Several years afterwards, his house was burgled and all his medals were stolen. Although they were later recovered, his health was quite affected by this incident, and he died not long afterwards in February 1972. He was given a funeral with full military honours in his local village church near Doncaster, and his ashes were later interred in Nocton churchyard in Lincolnshire. And my apologies, I've run over a little bit from the time that my
It's fine.
timekeeper
I thought that was brilliant. I think a
allocated
round of
to me.
applause is due.
But